All right, welcome everybody. My name is Erich Reed and I'm the director of the Southwest Harbor Public Library. And we are mid-stride in our annual art auction featuring over 50 local artists. You can buy it now or wait till the end of the month. Thank you, Diane Zito. We've got her piece Quiet Side, right up the top of the stairs if anyone wants to make the trek, and it already has an opening bid, so thank you. Come back this Thursday. We've got a Edith Hamilton hybrid event, which is going to be a unique mix of local history and academic content. So it should be pretty interesting. So we're recording this event tonight, and if you're online and you have any questions, please use the chat feature, and Kate will help facilitate your questions at the end of the program. Books will be for sale and for signing afterwards. So Zoe Weil is the co-founder and president of the Institute for Humane Education, also the author of Most Good, Least Harm, A Simple Principle. I can speak to Zoe's educational impact in my previous role as a school librarian. She addressed the freshman class, and shortly after there was an influx of self-directed social action by some of the audience. And I expect some of us tonight to be impacted by her presentation. Please warmly welcome Zoe Weil.
Thank you all for coming out on this, it's a beautiful afternoon, and here you are inside. Thank you so much for being here. So what I'm going to talk about today and my book are based on a very simple idea that a better world is possible. So by a show of hands, how many of you periodically or maybe frequently feel angry, frustrated, maybe even despairing and anxious about the state of either your community or our country or the world? Okay, well, I'm with my people. I feel those things too. And I manage those feelings by reminding myself of how much has changed for the better in my own lifetime. So I'm 63 years old. When I was born, 90% of the people, sorry, I'm already off, 50% of the people in the world lived in extreme poverty. Now that number is below 10%. Still way too high, but that's changed for the better. 90% of people now have electricity, whereas when I was born, only 50% did. So that's an improvement. When I was born, it was illegal in many states for Black and white people to get married. That has changed. The Civil Rights Act was passed when I was 3 years old. I grew up in New York City. Smog and soot coated the city, coated many cities in the United States, and now the air is actually cleaner in this country, wildfires notwithstanding. Waterways were catching on fire. Lakes and rivers were catching on fire. Our waterways are actually cleaner now. Most girls and women when I was born did not aspire to careers beyond teaching, nursing, and secretarial work. And now women not only are in all careers, but more girls go to college than boys in the United States. And around the world, the vast majority of girls go to school. So it's an improvement. Gay, lesbian, and trans people were mostly closeted, and now we have marriage equality, and many of those rights are encoded in laws. And finally, when I was young, issues around animal cruelty were not on anyone's radar. Most people didn't care about those issues, and now, according to a Gallup poll, the vast majority of people think that animals should not be treated cruelly. Now, I do not want to suggest by all of this that we should be Pollyannish about this or that we have arrived. We have not arrived. 700 million people in the world still live in extreme poverty. Racism, sexism, homophobia, these all persist. We've taken steps forward and we've also taken some steps back. So we have a long way to go. But this is all to say that things can be bad and better at the same time. And if they can be better, they can be better still. So how do we make them better? And why is it important that I've spent all this time pointing this out? It's important because so many of us feel so anxious and so despairing and often hopeless about the ability to create change. And many of those people who feel this are young people. And that is really not okay. And it's not okay because if you don't believe that things can change for the better, why would you try? And I'm going to tell you a couple of stories to illustrate this. So the first story is 12 years old. Few of you have heard this story a few times. So I was invited to speak at a school in Connecticut 12 years ago. And it was a middle school. And when I arrived, I was going to talk to the 5th and 6th graders. And I asked them to share with me what they thought were the biggest problems in the world. And I wrote down what they said on a whiteboard until that whiteboard was completely full. One boy even said sex trafficking. 5th and 6th graders. He had not been learning about this at school. So then I asked them to raise their hands if they could imagine us solving the problems they listed on the whiteboard. And of the 45 children in that room, only 5 raised their hands. Only 5 could even imagine us solving those problems. So again, what's going to motivate them to try if they can't even imagine a better future? So I knew I had to do something to transform how they were feeling. So I asked them to close their eyes and I led them in a guided visualization. And in the visualization, I asked them to imagine themselves very old and at the end of a long and well-lived life. And I asked them to imagine themselves sitting on a park bench on a beautiful day. The air was clean, the waterways were clean, the birds were singing, and there hadn't been a war in as long as they could remember, and nobody went to bed hungry, and we had learned to treat each other and other animals with respect and compassion. And then I asked them to imagine a child coming up and joining them on the park bench. And the child had been studying history in school and learning about darker times. And the child wanted to know, how did everything change for the better? And so I invited them to answer the child's questions in their imagination. And then the child asked this final question: what role did you play in helping to bring about this better world? What did you do? And while they had their eyes closed, I asked them to raise their hands if now they could imagine us solving the problems they listed on the whiteboard. And this time 40 hands went up in the air. All it took to restore their hope was a vision of a better world and knowing that they played a part in creating it. So fast forward 3 years, I was in Guadalajara, Mexico to speak at a teachers conference. And the day before the conference began, I was invited to visit the school that was hosting the event. And when I got there, they said, hey, will you talk to the 5th graders? So remembering that time in Connecticut, I went in and I asked those 5th graders to raise their hands if they thought we could solve the problems in the world. And this time, every hand flew up in the air immediately. What was different? What was different was that their teacher had been teaching them in age-appropriate ways about problems, specifically problems relating to the environment, and they had been involved in solving them. Their own school had installed solar panels. They created a composting system for their food waste. They were using reusable bottles to fill up with water rather than disposables. They knew that problems could be solved because they were solving them, because their teacher was teaching them to be solutionaries. So what we do at the Institute for Humane Education is we train people to be humane educators who can teach about the interconnected issues of human rights and environmental sustainability and animal protection. And we work with schools, and we have a solutionary program so that teachers can bring the solutionary framework to their students. And I just want to give a shout out to the director of our graduate programs, Mary Pat Champeau, raise your hand in case anybody wants to talk to you afterwards. And Julie Meltzer, who's the director of our K-12 and teacher education, who's running our K-12 outreach. So you have like the leaders of these programs here if you want to talk to them afterwards. So why this approach? Because we believe that if we don't educate a generation of solutionaries, if we don't transform education, which is the root system underlying every other societal system, then we're going to be hard pressed to create that better world. At the same time, that's the long game. It's going to take a while to educate a generation of solutionaries and ensure that whatever fields they go into, they know how to transform them so that they're humane, sustainable, and just. So that's why I wrote The Solutionary Way, because we need everybody to become solutionaries, or if not everybody, then enough people to become solutionaries and apply it to their lives, to their professions, to their volunteer work, to their activism, to their charitable giving, so that we can transform systems. So I've thrown out this word solutionaries a lot, and you might be saying, yeah, but what is a solutionary? So a solutionary is somebody who can identify unsustainable, unjust, and inhumane systems and transform them in ways that do the most good and the least harm for everybody. And when we say everybody, we mean all people, we mean animals, and we mean the environment that sustains all of us. So that's what a solutionary is. And a solutionary is not synonymous with a problem solver. You might be thinking, like, why'd you make up a word? We have problem solvers. Why do we need solutionaries? And the reason is because of that ethical foundation that lies at the root of this word. A solutionary is somebody who's striving to do the most good and the least harm. So you can imagine a problem solver who's an engineer who can solve the problem of blowing up a mountaintop for coal removal, or who can solve the problem of damming a river. They're not a solutionary. A solutionary is also not synonymous with humanitarian. So we need humanitarians. When people are suffering, we need to help. But humanitarians aren't focused on addressing the causes of that suffering and harm. That's what solutionaries are doing. They're looking at the causes and they're addressing them and transforming them. So I like to say that a solutionary is a next level change maker. So how do you become a solutionary? So I always like to invite people to answer for themselves 3 questions that will help guide your path toward becoming a solutionary. The first question is, what are the issues that concern you? What problem do you want to solve? The next question is, what are you good at? Now, we don't know all the things that we're good at because we haven't tried everything, but you know some of the things that you're good at. So think about those things. What are you good at? And then the third question is, what do you love to do? Because if you can find the place where the answers to those 3 questions meet, you are on your road to being a solutionary, and even more, to having great meaning and purpose in your life as you combine those answers. So one of the things I write about in the book is what I've learned from improv comedy about being a solutionary. So my husband, Edwin, right here, raise your hand. He and I have been taking improv comedy classes for a couple decades now. And there are some foundational rules in improv comedy. They're just really beautiful rules for solving problems in general. So I'm going to share those 4 rules with you, and then I'm going to talk about 2 of them. So the 4 rules are: build relationships, embrace the concept of yes and I'll explain what I mean by that, bring the love, and help others shine. So those are the 4 rules. So how do they work on stage? So imagine two actors and they get on stage. The first thing that they are going to do is they are going to build a relationship. I'm going to pause for 1 second because Erich, it is getting a little warm now. Can we turn the air conditioning back on? Here we were, I was like, turn that down, and I'm gonna shiver, and look all anxious up there. But it did get hot, didn't it? Yeah, okay, so they're gonna get on stage and they're gonna build a relationship, because if they don't have a relationship, they're not gonna know how to relate to each other. The audience isn't gonna relate to them. The scene's not gonna go anywhere. So picture one actor getting on stage and saying to the other actor on stage, hey, mom, I entered us into the parent-child acrobatic competition at school. So the next thing that's going to happen is that the scene partner is going to embrace this idea of yes and. What do I mean by that? They are going to say yes to that role. They are not going to say, I'm not your mother, I don't do acrobatics, because what would happen? The scene would die. Nobody would be laughing. People would be thinking, this is a really bad show. I'm sorry I paid for it. So the scene partner is going to say, that's great, Brian. We can finally wear the pink polka dot leotards that I purchased on eBay. Okay, now the scene's moving forward. Now, the scene partner could have said any number of things, but what they did was they said yes to the role and they added more to it by saying and, not necessarily saying and explicitly, but saying it implicitly. Okay, what does this have to do with being a solutionary? So solutionaries need to build relationships. They need to build relationships with partners and collaborators to solve problems. And they also need to build relationships with people they don't agree with. They need to learn the perspectives of others. And this is really hard. How many people find it hard here to build relationships with people whose political or religious ideas you find abhorrent? How many people have a hard time? Okay, a lot of us have a hard time with that. To be a solutionary, I urge you to try to overcome the difficulty of doing that. The reason is, if we want to solve problems, we really need to understand the perspectives of others. We need to talk to a variety of stakeholders. Obviously, those who are harmed by the problem that we want to solve, but also those who are benefiting from the systems that perpetuate it. If we don't understand the likelihood that we are going to be able to come up with solutions that will be more widely adopted is smaller. This is, if nothing else, a strategy. Now, I also find it more than a strategy. I find it really important to build relationships with people who think differently than I do and who believe different things than I do. It helps me to think more clearly. It helps me challenge my own belief systems. So that is a really important improv comedy rule that I invite you to bring to your life. And then what about yes and? Chances are when you talk to people who don't agree with you, you are going to be able to find places of agreement. You will not disagree about everything. You are going to find these places of agreement, and from there you can say yes to that, and then you can add your and you're going to offer your ideas and you're going to invite them to offer their ideas. And it's a give and take, and that give and take can happen once you have said yes to something you agree with. So I know probably some of you are thinking, I can never do this, but I challenge you to try, because practicing this is one of the most effective ways that we can build collaborations across divides, and we can bridge divides, and we can reduce the polarization that is tearing our communities apart. Actually, I should say tearing our country apart. It's not always tearing our communities apart. If you go to your city council and you have all sorts of people in there, you're going to find so much agreement across big divides. You're in community together. This happens all the time in these small towns in Maine. It doesn't happen so well in our country as a whole. Why? Because that polarization is fueled by politicians and the media and memes on social media, and it's fueled and it's fomented. So I'm going to leave that from there. Next tip I have for you is to strive to be a campfire rather than a forest fire. Now, this may be a room of campfire people already, but I'm one of those people who's more a forest fire and has some work to be a campfire. So what do I mean by this? Okay, imagine yourself in a clearing in the woods, and there's a beautiful campfire. And people are drawn toward it. You're drawn toward it. There's a circle of people surrounding this campfire. People's faces are glowing. People want to be there. They are happy. They are part of community. Now picture somebody adding a lot of fuel to that fire and some sparks flying and it igniting a tree. And now a forest fire is starting to burn. And now people are fleeing this forest, as are you. So what does this have to do with us? So we each have a fire inside of us. It's the fire of our passions, our concerns, what we care about. And how we fuel that fire is going to determine what kind of fire we are. So to the degree that we can strive to be a campfire, we are going to have more and more people surrounding us, wanting to learn from us, wanting to be in community with us, wanting to collaborate with us. And if we start to burn out of control because we've added too much fuel to our fire and we become really hot, we may push people away. Now, what is this fuel I'm talking about? So for me, this fuel is learning about the problems in our world, learning about the atrocities and the destruction. And if I spend too much time fueling my fire with more and more of the terrible things that are happening, I start to burn hotter and hotter. And I have pushed people away because I burn too hot. So I need to figure out what is the right amount of fuel. I need some fuel, right? If I don't have any fuel, I'm not going to know about the issues. I'm not going to be able to do anything. I'll just burn out. I might burn out because I got too hot, but I might burn out because there's just no fuel. So to the degree that you can introspect, who are you? Do you need more fuel to make a difference in the world? Add more fuel and make that difference. If you're somebody who you spend a lot of time with fuel and people just don't want to hear from you, go for a walk, go for a hike, meditate, take care of yourself so that you can burn just right. Okay, next step is to cultivate a solutionary mindset. So what do I mean by a solutionary mindset? So a solutionary mindset believes that problems can be solvable. So it comes to any problem with that fundamental belief, not only a better world is possible, but this problem can be solved. A solutionary mindset tries to avoid either or thinking, which is constant in our society. We are presented all the time with two sides to issues. And that happens in our political system, that happens in our legal system, happens in our education system when we have debates. So I'm going to tell you a story about when this really was driven home for me about how important it was to look beyond either or thinking. So this was in 2009. I'm driving in my car and listening to the radio, and there's an ad for an upcoming debate at NYU about this question. Is the United States responsible for Mexico's drug wars? And I remember feeling immediately perplexed by the question, because I thought, they're going to bring in these experts, these people who have really studied this issue. They're really smart, and they are going to be on one side or the other of this question. which is a fabricated question. And they're going to try to argue their case and win, and the audience is going to vote on who won. That's what the whole debate was about. These debates still happen. It was originally through Intelligence Squared, and now it has a new name. And I thought to myself, wouldn't it make more sense to bring these experts together to talk about how we solve the problem of Mexico's drug wars, or ask what are the root causes of these drug wars? What are the root causes of inequity and lack of education and poverty that drive these drug wars? What are the impacts of these issues in our communities? How do we actually stop drug overdoses and deaths? Like, these are problems. Can we address those problems directly instead of having this argument about the culpability of these wars? So I began to think that I didn't want this idea of avoiding either or thinking to itself become another either or. There are times to take sides. I'm not suggesting that we don't, but I am suggesting that when we bring a solutionary mindset, we are thinking about what is the underlying problem and how do we address it. Okay, next tip is to cultivate solutionary thinking. So what do I mean by solutionary thinking? So solutionary thinking is comprised of many forms of thinking. Would you like to come back? Don't feel like you're interrupting, come like that. So the foundational form of thinking for solutionary thinking is critical thinking. Critical thinking lies at the foundation, because if we don't have critical thinking, we're not going to be able to do any of the other kinds of thinking. So critical thinking is hard to cultivate, right? We live in a society where AI and information is coming at us from all directions. How do we know what's true, right? How do we know what's happening in another part of our country, let alone another part of the world? We only know what we know because we trust the sources. So how can we find trustworthy sources? How can we check them? How can we distinguish fact from opinion? This is what cultivating critical thinking is all about. The next thing we need is systems thinking. So you can't really be a systems thinker if you're not a critical thinker, because in systems thinking, we're looking at all of these interconnected systems and we're trying to understand the role they play in the problem we want to solve. Then we need strategic thinking so that we can actually find the leverage points to create change. And finally, we're going to have critical thinking coming into play in this entire process so that when it comes to solving problems, we are able to think creatively. So these forms of thinking are cultivated in the solutionary framework that we use with students in schools and that I write about in the book. So the solutionary framework is a process and a practice that has 4 phases. The first phase is to identify the problem that you want to solve. The next phase is to investigate it thoroughly, including by reaching out to stakeholders, reaching out to those who have strived to solve this problem, finding out what's worked, what's failed, learning from it. And then exploring what are the causes of this problem, both the root causes, like our beliefs and our values and our mindsets and our worldviews, but then also what are the systemic causes? Like those root causes, our beliefs and our values cause us to create these systems that then create these problems. So what are those systems? And then finally, next phase is to innovate a solution. Now, you do not have to be Einstein to innovate a solution. In fact, the solution you may come up with may not be your own. You may find it somewhere else, and you may see it taking root somewhere else, and you're going to apply it in your context, in your community, because it's a great solution and it needs to take root and expand. Or you might hear of some amazing solution that hasn't taken root anywhere because the person who came up with it is great at inventing it, but not great at sharing it. So you're the sharer. That might be your role. So they're all different ways to be that innovator, to develop the solution you're gonna implement, which is the fourth phase, to implement. So all of these phases, they start with the letter I, so I can remember them. And it's identify, investigate, innovate, and implement. And implement is really important, right? If you do all this work and then you never put it into practice, you may not feel like you're the solutionary you want to be. It's all in your head and you haven't gotten it out in the world. So make sure to get it out in the world and make sure that when you've identified that problem you want to address, that it's feasible within your sphere of influence. It's something you can do with others. And then you want to iterate on it. You want to evaluate it, you want to improve upon it, and you want to keep going. So that is the process. So now I've given you all my tips. And you may be feeling a couple of things. One thing you may be feeling is like, okay, Zoe, I am not going to remember half of that. What do I really do from here? Shameless plug for my book. Get my book, because it will outline this. It will be your guide for this. And the solutionary framework is one chapter in the book. It is not a wonky book. It is full of stories. It is full of examples. And the last chapter is full of solutions that people have come up with to shift systems. So, plug for my book. You might also be thinking, well, I might want more than the book. Well, we have a sign-up sheet. So you can learn about the Institute for Humane Education. You can get our newsletter. You can go to our website and download a lot of our free resources, and you can be involved with us. We have this wonderful community called Circle. We offer loads of free gatherings, and we have one tomorrow. So if you are really fired up after you leave here today, we have a free solutionary webinar that is going to be, I'm going to be participating in it, but it's being led by Katie Whalen, who is a former congressional staffer and a brilliant, amazing woman who works on public policy. Public policy is one of those levers for change. So 2 p.m. tomorrow, and there's a flyer for it, and all you need to do is just take out your phone and scan that QR code, and you can register for tomorrow's free webinar with Katie, the amazing Katie. Okay, so if you're feeling like, okay, I'll ask, how many of you are feeling like, okay, yeah, this is great, but this feels overwhelming to me? Be honest if you feel that way. Okay, thanks, honey.
Somebody had to raise their hand.
Another impinging as well. Okay, so if you are feeling that, and if you just were trying to be polite, so you didn't raise your hand, but you're actually feeling that, here's my pushback for you. Going on this journey is going to enrich your own life. It is going to add meaning. It's going to add purpose. It's going to add community. It's going to add hope. Why? Because you will be connecting with other people who care about what you care about, and you will together be solving problems. I recommend not doing this process by yourself. That's why we have the Circle community. That's why we're offering webinars. That's why I'm saying sign up. Be part of the solutionary movement. This is not something that you just want to be doing by yourself. Unless you're super introverted and you love doing things by yourself, in which case, please just do it by yourself, because we need all the solutionaries that we can find. So there are a couple of quotes that I want to share with you. My favorite quote about hope is from Professor David Orr. He's a professor at Oberlin College. And he once said, hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. So, I asked you at the very beginning of this talk, if you were feeling anxious or despairing or any of those things, and I think everybody raised their hands. Hope is a verb with its sleeves rolled up. And if we roll up our sleeves together, I just got shivers. It feels really great. So, another favorite quote is from Mahatma Gandhi. He was once asked by a reporter, what is your message? Now, you know, he had a big message, you know, he was trying to free his country from British rule using only nonviolent methods. Not something we in America were able to do. We had a big war to do that. So that was a big message. But on that particular day, he'd taken a vow of silence. And so when the reporter asked him, what is your message? He jotted down on a piece of paper, my life is my message. That's all he wrote. My life is my message. And when I read that, I was so struck by the universality of that statement. If Gandhi's life is his message, that meant that my life was my message. All of our lives are our message. Do you live your life right now with the message you want? If so, that's awesome. If it's not quite the message you want, how can you strive to make it more of the message you want? And my guess is that if you embark on the solutionary way, it will be more of the message that you want. So last quote comes from Marcus Aurelius, who said, what we do now echoes in eternity. What other people did before us is why things are better, bad and better. What we do now can make things much, much better. So a little earlier, I told you about that guided visualization that I did with those 5th and 6th graders in Connecticut. So I want you to pause for a moment and think about what you want to say to a child who comes up to you at the end of your long and well-lived life and says, what did you do to make things better? What would you like to say that you did? And when you leave here tonight, go out and do it. Thank you.
Do you have any questions or comments? And Kate, if you have anything from online, please share.
I have nothing right now, but if we could have the postcard with the link, that'd be great. I can share that with the folks online. Questions, everybody, thank you so much. Any questions? Yes?
I'm wondering about scale. Because you asked if anybody felt overwhelmed. And it's easy to feel that way as soon as you get out of the individual and move to your family and then your community. And a lot of the principles that you shared with us, I think must work. But it feels global. So I'm just wondering how someone would begin to adopt some of the principles, but on a scale that wasn't overwhelming. I'm not saying that it all has to be little introverts, but you know, what are the baby steps?
So I'm really glad that you asked that, Susan. So first of all, I want to say that our work is expanding globally. So we are on 6 continents. We're in more than 24 countries, thanks to Julie. And students all over are learning this framework. And they need to take baby steps because we cannot have 6th graders tackling global warming or poverty. We need them to look at how can they in their school community, for example, reduce their carbon footprint? How can they reduce poverty in their own community? So I would say the first way to go about this is the same way that those 6th graders would, which is what's the issue you care about, but what's feasible within your sphere of influence and what can you address locally? So if you have more and more people doing that, lots can happen. Now, what is also your profession, where do you have connections? So for example, a physician who I know, he has 2 clinics in the LA area, and he's decided to make the book a book club reading for both of his clinics. So everybody's going to read that book, and they are going to apply this solutionary framework to healthcare in their clinic. One of the organizations that I mentioned in chapter 6, that's the solutions chapter, he's right. There's a section on criminal justice solutions, and the person who I'm mentioning, or the organization, is the Justice Innovation Lab. And because I mentioned it, and because the person who founded that, Jared Fishman, offered to read that section of the book for me, I sent him a copy of the book. And he read the book, and he immediately got back to me, and he said, I'm gonna have my law students reading this. So he was applying it in his context in law. So in my dream world, the book becomes a massive bestseller, and everybody is applying it in whatever way they are able. And that's how we build this movement. We don't let ourselves get overwhelmed by what we can't do. We focus on what we can do and spreading this message and building this movement. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, one of the problems today, and you mentioned it, is all this, the media and all this, and the AI, and what's right and what's wrong and and so the building of critical thinking is extremely important there. And how do you do that within your schools with the really younger children to get them to start filtering information?
Julie, would you like to take that one on?
Sure. One of the things that we know right now is that it's very hard to tell what you can trust online, right? It's very hard to tell.
It's hard to see.
Where do you want me to go?
Please, Ed.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay. One of the things is that it's very hard to tell what's true and what's not. And there's a lot of people who are really actively working to deceive you, right? Deceive all of us into thinking things that we might not know whether it's true or not. Like we did an exercise with teachers recently, and he said, okay, you have 5 minutes to find 2 facts about plastics pollution that you didn't know before, and then share them at the table. And then I said, how many of you are not sure whether the facts that you just found, going to websites you know are reliable, are true? And about 1/3 of the people raised their hand. These were teachers who went to reliable sites. So what we have started saying, you might not like this answer, but what we have started saying is that you should curate a list of things of sites you know are true. And then work with kids to deepen their critical thinking and their analysis of what you know is to be good information. So that the practice is not in finding good information, the practice is in working with good information so that you know, you can recognize it, you can ask questions about it, you can begin to use it, your growing understanding of how to interrogate.
Can you start that right from the get-go?
Absolutely.
Good.
Yes.
Yeah, I want to talk about your book for a minute. It's a wonderful book. I used up a couple of yellow Sharpies, not Sharpies, but highlighters, highlighting different areas of the book.
So now with the strays, I can flip to that page.
You covered so many areas, and one that I kept, it really impacted me was the impact that we have with our diets, eating, especially red meat. And I have begun buying in the last couple of years vegetable substitutes that taste very much like hamburger and steak. And I think we're going further and further in that direction. And what you point out in there, the suffering that animals go through, the beef industry is especially brutal, as well as raising chickens. And you just did a beautiful job convincing me that we really need to, as much as we like a good filling, begin altering, maybe not as often, and trying some alternatives that don't result in slaughter of millions of animals every year. Our granddaughter will not eat beef. She's a senior in college, hasn't wanted to eat beef for 5 or 6 years, 7 years now. And it's all about the environment and the suffering that the animals and the pollution that it causes. Well, and you do a great job talking about all of it in there.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, the food system is one of those systems that has just an enormously big impact on everyone, right? So on the environment, as you mentioned, on animals, but also on our health. And so it's one of those systems that is so critical that we address and we solve a lot of problems within that system. So in the chapter 6, which is the solutions chapter, it starts off with food system solutions because that is one of the biggest systems that we need to shift and change. So thanks for that. And thanks for the plug for the book. I didn't pay him, but. Any other questions? Anything from the online audience? Well, thank you all so much. And if anybody wants to get that book, I brought a couple of my other books, sign the sign-up sheet. I'm happy to sign books if you want, and I really appreciate you coming out tonight.
I'd like to observe that probably one of the reasons for the success of your system is that you stand in front of people and look in their eyes. You're magic at that.
Thank you. Thank you.